Some will argue that after 60 years, NATO is stronger than ever. They point to the Eastern European expansion and NATO's presence in Afghanistan. But critics say NATO is a shell of its former self.
NATO, frankly, is weaker than ever.
Jed Babin, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, says the U.S. has always dominated NATO, but since the end of the Cold War, most of our allies have downsized their forces to the extreme.
Most of the European militaries are not very capable of acting beyond their own borders. Most of the NATO nations have either unilaterally disarmed or simply gone their own way, unless they are unified with the United States and are thus able to deploy to foreign lands. They're really not much use to anybody on the battlefield.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was founded as a defensive shield against Soviet invasion, and NATO worked because the Soviets knew that NATO would fight. But as NATO expands into Eastern Europe, into Russia's backyard, Russia needs to know that NATO will fight. And NATO needs to know that it's going to be defending nations that are a long way from Western Europe. Since 1949, NATO's membership has increased 5 times, from the original 12 nations to 26. And it will increase to 28 when Albania and Croatia complete the membership process. Article 5 of the NATO Charter says an attack on any member nation is an attack on the alliance. So would the Western Europeans with their shrinking armies be willing to fight the Russians in Eastern Europe? Or in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia, a NATO hopeful which was crushed by Russia last year?
Well, I mean, I must say I find it very difficult to envisage such a thing, and so I think would a majority of Europeans.
John Wiles is the former Brussels bureau chief for London's Financial Times.
I mean, I actually wonder how many people actually realize that there is this attack on one is an attack on all clause, Article 5.
Now, the principal threat, of course, is Islamic terrorism, and the NATO nations are by no means united in a means or even the need to fight that particular threat.
Polls show that most Europeans do not want to send any more troops to Afghanistan. In World War I, France suffered almost 400,000 casualties in the Battle of Verdun and kept fighting. When 10 died in Afghanistan last year, there was strong public pressure to withdraw. Spain recently announced it will abandon the NATO peacekeeping mission in Kosovo, and it did so without consulting NATO. Madrid has declared that its army is pacifist, and its last defense minister forbid Spanish troops from using lethal force against the Taliban. That's the current defense minister in the white shirt. She has declared herself a pacifist. Germany has kept its forces away from the fighting in Afghanistan. A report by its own government concluded that German soldiers in Afghanistan spend most of their time lounging around and drinking beer. So much so that many are now too out of shape to fight. Britain and Canada have been exceptions in Afghanistan with more casualties per capita than the United States. But Babin, a retired Air Force officer, says that when NATO joins the fight, America's military is so far ahead technologically that many allies have trouble keeping up.
America's military is organized on what we call the network-centric battlefield. Unless you're good enough to operate in that doctrine, in that environment, unless you can literally plug into our computer networks, it's best if you just get out of the way, because you're just going to be in the way, frankly.
Frank Gaffney was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration.
The problem has been, as long as the nations of Europe, particularly the Western European relatively rich nations, have not stepped up to the plate in terms of maintaining their military and equipping it properly to deal with the kinds of challenges that it's being asked to face today.
NATO's biggest challenge may be that it no longer has a unifying force, the threat from the Soviet Union. In fact, in a conflict with Russia, Western Europe would be called upon to fight its major energy supplier. You can be sure that one of the first things Russia would do in a military confrontation with NATO is turn off its pipeline. For a military alliance to work, the alliance members have to be ready and willing to fight. And on NATO's 60th anniversary, that proposition is increasingly in doubt. Dale Hurd, CBN News, Brussels.